Even as we speak, in one district, there's I can't remember the name of it now, but there's the bloating of the stomach that happens from malnutrition. That is a known problem in the one region in South Africa as we speak. This is in the modern day South Africa. You've got some areas that have 78% unemployment in certain areas. In general, I think the last figure they gave, national unemployment was 44%, but that's probably a charitable figure. So Matt, you've got really quite dystopian conditions, you know. So yes, I would say that when you compare the policy of massive organizations like the APA and in the American Psychology Association in America and other organizations around the Western world, where they seem determined to create victims. They are knowingly, despite available evidence and better alternatives. That's the part that's really sick. Despite better alternatives, they would rather create iatrogenic harm, victims of unintended consequence of medical treatment. All right, that's iatrogenic harm. Sometimes surgical. I mean, thousands of cases now, thousands and thousands of cases where these people are dependent on the state. So now, how convenient to create, which is exactly what they're doing in South Africa. You're creating an entire subculture of victimology or of dependence that require the state to provide grants or pensions or disability, as you would call it in America, because they literally survive on that.
My guest today is Vincent Deboni, a South African-born therapist living in Sweden who works with detransitioners, transcending gender, in his words. His experiences in social justice organizing, his years of suffering orthorexia, as well as the decline of his native country from the effects of identity politics, have given Vincent Deboni valuable insight and understanding as to what is happening with transgender identification worldwide. Vincent, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Matt. It's good to be here.
For our listeners who will not be familiar with you at all, can you tell us a little bit about your background leading up to the moment when COVID changed everything for you personally as well as everybody else? My understanding is that you were a starving artist and you took that a little too far, and that experience gave you insight into the mind of the dysphoric or dysmorphic person. Is that more or less correct?
Wow. Well, yes, and no. It began, the starving artist part was when I was much younger. Certainly my journey has been through a lot of struggle and trying to figure out my own identity when I had orthorexia, which it's basically just an obsession with food, obsession with what you're consuming. So in other words, someone can look healthy but still be orthorexic. It's not a DSM diagnosis, but it relates to anorexia. Okay, so I began with orthorexia and then it developed into anorexia, quite severe anorexia between the age of 16 and 23. I didn't realize, obviously, at the time, but that I was experimenting with my identity, with my sexuality, with my understanding of masculinity, basically. Okay. Many years later, when I finally studied psychology, I studied psychology in midlife. I was an entrepreneur for about 21 years. And then, as you say, up until when COVID hit and, destroyed the hospitality industry. But by then, I'd basically already done my psychology degree and I was qualifying as a therapist.
Yes, and that speaks to the role of empathy in being a successful therapist in any case, let alone with a detransitioner. And you've worked with, I believe, 70 of them now, I think you say, and you have a report. What are your main takeaways from that report?
Mm. Yeah, thanks, mate. So the report that I did was, for people who don't know, in 2023, we offered a support group through Beyond Transition, which is part of GenSpect, more as a result of some efforts that we'd already made to just create spaces for detransitioners to talk to each other. Okay, so it wasn't intended as a therapeutic space. And then when I went to the GenSpect conference in Killarney, which was in 2023, I met a bunch of detransitioners, and that really was kind of impressed on me, that this was a need that they all had, well, that they felt that other detransitioners could benefit from. So anyway, long story short, we went ahead with it. So I just want to sort of clarify, though, that it was not that group, and the group that I still run is not a therapeutic space. It's merely a safe space for detransitioners actually to meet each other. Okay. Which has worked really well. But anyway, when I started these groups, because there's now two, there's a male and a female one, we agreed. It was kind of in the intro kind of thing, when I would screen people to come into the group, because sometimes people benefit more from one-on-one counseling or therapy rather than joining a group. So you've got to be ethical and kind of figure that out first. And I would always say to them, are you happy for any findings that I have in working with this group to be fed back to the people that need to know? And they all agreed with that on an ongoing basis. It was something that I kept sort of checking. And then I realized they were having the Lisbon GenSpect conference, and I realized there was an opportunity there to give GenSpect a more complete report purely of the themes and patterns. So I was very careful not to call this a study, because the members did not agree to a study anyway. And I didn't have I mean, at best you could say it was a thematic analysis of the content of the group. Okay, so I would look at their language, I would make notes, obviously, but there were certain things, Matt, that stuck out quite dramatically. Okay, and what that was, which only hit me later on, was one of them was the fact that they all agree it's a cult, that there's a doctrine involved. It's not just about like a gender pathology. Okay, so when someone says, I believe I was in a cult, we should listen to them first of all, and we should pay attention to the detail that this wasn't just a physical distress, a gender dysphoria. It was also a social contagion, as other people have called it, and the cult aspect comes into it, in which you need to conform to the doctrine of the ideology. Okay, so that's an important aspect that I think a lot of people, if you haven't really delved into gender ideology, you don't really know what we mean by that. But I'm telling you that the detransitioners all agreed, all of them agreed, that it did form the sort of criteria of a cult, because there was a doctrine involved. Okay. Then the other aspect was the fact that the groups had to be split. Okay. So I ran one group for about 3 months, I think it was, 3 or 4 months maybe. And then I realized it needed to be split, because first of all, you had people that had socially transitioned, mixing with people that had taken HRT, mixing with other people who had surgery. On top of that, you're mixing both sexes. Okay, so I realized this wasn't really working. I was talking to some people privately, and they were telling me things privately that they admitted they were fearful of admitting in the group, or of talking about in the group, should I say. So I experimented a little bit. I took the males to a different group, and I left the girls in a different group. And immediately there was a very different dynamic, where the girls were far more able to be honest with each other, and the boys were also able to be honest with each other. Sorry for me calling them boys all the time. It's just, to me, they're younger than me, so I see them as boys. But some of them were most certainly grown men, who had completely detransitioned, but some of them had had surgery. Some of them had developed breast tissue, which they now hid by ironically wearing binders. And that group carried on for a while, and then we ended up with a slightly smaller group of just the males who'd had bottom surgery. Okay, so a lot of people kind of moved on from the group. My feeling was all along that this shouldn't be something that is permanent. You shouldn't need the group support permanently. So I always urged people to, if you don't want to attend, then just just leave the group. So we would have these little ceremonies where people would announce that they're leaving, and we all celebrated, because the idea is obviously that you go on with your life. That's actually the point. So the other aspect that I wanted to highlight is the fact that when you take the males aside and you take the females aside, and also that other dynamic of the ones that have had surgery versus the ones that only did hormones, you've got very different pathology between the men and the females, the males and the females, and everything's different. The etiology, the origins and the causes, and the process of detransition is quite significantly different. Okay. So to unpack that, you really need a space where males can talk to males and the females can talk to females. The females luckily accepted me, so they were very open about their experiences, very open, sometimes hilariously so. And I don't mean to make light of anything that they're going through, but certainly they were able to laugh at some of the things that they had to process. The males, I must say, there was a few females that had bottom surgery that didn't stay in the group for very long because they had quite significant trauma, and I would sometimes refer them to one-on-one therapy instead. And I've left with a male group that is just males that have had bottom surgery. There was, for a few weeks, there was detransitioners who were male who were basically, or by their definition, gay men. We had that group for a few weeks, but that also didn't last long. They all went on to one-on-one therapy, as far as I know. The report's quite detailed because it spans just over a year of work with the detransitioners. But the biggest thing that I noticed, what I didn't expect, was the significant differences between the sexes. The recovery path, once they've had surgery, is dramatically different. So the people that have had surgery can't really have a conversation with the people that are just doing hormones. These are very different scenarios. So that's what I would summarize as the major findings that I had. And then there's obviously a whole bunch of stuff, Matt, that I could get into, but probably better if people read the report themselves,
Well, you've given us a very interesting sort of preview there. What I find fascinating is that it all splits at sex difference. Oh, imagine that. The human race is different
Exactly.
at sex difference. The results are different. The process of healing is different. Everything is different. So you've answered several questions that I had about this report. So let's shift gears for a moment because
Okay.
I find this parallel from your biography fascinating. You call South Africa the critical race theory state, CRT
Mm.
state, right? One party rule has certainly been a disaster. What do you think the point of no return was? Was it COVID and Black Lives Matter? Did these events act as a kind of permission structure, to borrow a phrase from political psychology?
Mm.
Because I watched someone leading a crowd in
Mm.
chants of kill the white farmer, for example, and I
Mm.
think
Mm.
this is a cult. This is another cult. It's not just racist, it's a dangerous cult. What do you think? What's
Absolutely.
going on there?
Matt, so I might get a bit worked up because this is my country we're talking about, and I have since left the country 3 years ago. We liquidated, we packed up everything into 4 bags and left our country. I might visit, but I probably will never live there again. So it's a bit of a sensitive topic to me, actually. But Matt, you asked me what is the point of no return. I have to be honest. probably the crucial moment came, I think, when Mandela died. Things could have gone either way. I think the truth is, I mean, look, there's probably 50 different moments we could choose. Arguably, if you go back in history, and we'd need to dig a little bit, Matt, and I know not everyone's a historian buff, but if you dig a little bit, you'll find that at the time in 1994, when Mandela was out, we had the CODESA arrangement, which was basically something where the old government and the stakeholders of the new South Africa were all meeting. This went on for, I think, 2 years, where we were negotiating the constitution, we were negotiating power structures, all these different things. But in that moment, we should have actually disbanded the ANC, which is the party, as you say, the one party rule. We've had ANC power for the last 30 years, essentially. They should have disbanded the ANC because it was a liberation organization. It was never a political party. This is a major, major distinction. And people the historians that have dealt with the specific, the transition of a country into democracy, the liberation organizations need to be disbanded because they are machines geared for activism, sometimes for terrorism, for aggressive actions, planting bombs and all that kind of stuff. What they should have done, and I remember people advising that at the time, and it was discussed, but I think it was very quickly dropped because the political power behind Mandela in general, and the ANC was so strong that what they managed to do was they formed the tripartite alliance, which was actually the ANC, the Communist Party, and the unions in South Africa. So now we know, now you look back on that and you go, wait, hold on. The unions, the Communist Party, and a violent liberation organization. I mean, I'm making the note of it being violent because that's just a fact of history. They adopted aggression to overthrow the apartheid government many, many years earlier. Okay, so I'm just making a technical point. I'm not, we can get into whether what they did was right or wrong, but I think I was too young to comment on that myself directly. So what I'm saying is these sort of pivotal points, the ANC should never have been on the ballot in 1994. Maybe Nelson Mandela should have been on the ballot in 1994. We might as well have called it Mandela's party. He would have won. He would have been president of the country. Okay. But the point being that the mechanisms of the party and of the unions and of this Communist Party would not have been, coalesced into this monolith that has ruled for the last 30 years. Unfortunately, what happened was too much power was concentrated in one place and they abused it. So when they handed the country to Jacob Zuma in, I think it was 2007, I might be wrong, but at some point they allowed Jacob Zuma to become president, despite the fact that we already knew that he was incompetent and corrupt, and he ruled for almost 2 terms until he was ousted by his own party. But by then, the damage was done. So the damage we're dealing with now, still now, in our infrastructure, in our electricity grid, and all these other things, in the legal system, in the labor system, across the board, there's just corruption, erosion, if we can call it that, chaos and lack of maintenance, and all these things are rampant. Okay, because it started effectively almost 20 years ago. Okay, so the pivotal point I would say was actually when Mandela died, and there wasn't a strong leadership to guide the country to a healthier form of democracy, which would have been a little bit merit-based. Okay, there is no meritocracy in South Africa.
Do you see a relationship, for example, between land reform, as it is euphemistically called, and things like the affirm policy? That's an all caps thing that I understand has programmatically installed the genderwoo policy across South African society the way Stonewall or the ACLU has in the US. Is there a relationship between land reform and gender, quote unquote, reform that made it easy to transplant transgenderism to South Africa? Is there an ideological connection there?
Well, I would say yes. Now, I'm sure some people would think that's a bit of a stretch. If you argued that with me, I would see that you're naive to the ideology that drives all of it. Okay. Critical race theory, for example, is driven by Marxist, you know, if we're going to be charitable, we can say neo-Marxist, but I mean, it's really the same thing. And postmodernist ideas of power hierarchy, intersectionality. Really, at the end of the day, it's the as Zoran has just reminded us recently, to control the levers of power. So it's a very power obsessed dynamic. And when you begin with an idea that those in power must be removed and the power and resources must be redistributed to the masses, what you've got is a system which is it's by design, it's anti-meritocratic. Okay. Now, the problem is in that, so whether we're talking about affirmation or we're talking about land reform, you've got a mechanism that's put into play. And the mechanism is to create a victim class. Okay. So the land reform requires us to believe that people owned this land before we did. People were productive on this land before we did. Before we, I mean, I never owned any farms in South Africa, so I shouldn't be calling myself we. My father was a builder in South Africa. He contributed far more to the well-being of modern South Africa than anything else. And he stayed there until he died. He had the option to go back to Italy, but didn't. So what you see one track where people have a social conscience and they contribute, they function within a meritocracy, and land ownership becomes how we transfer. It actually becomes a vehicle for transferring skills and merit. All right. So land ownership becomes, can you maintain the land? Can you do something useful with the land? If so, you can keep the land and you pay for the land and you reinvest in the land and you develop the land, basically, which is what's happened, generally has happened even till today across South Africa. But most people don't understand that by far the biggest owner of land in South Africa is actually the South African government, not private farms. Most of Southern Africa, when the colonizers arrived, and I'm happy to call them colonizers because that's exactly what they did, but you should consider that when they arrived, there was hardly anyone in Southern Africa. You had maybe a few thousand Bushmen on one end of Southern Africa. And on the other hand, you have, I think they estimate about 100 or 200,000 what we now call Zulus, which was actually just a few tribes scattered along the northeastern coast. But other explorers had already revealed that they had crossed Southern Africa and found no one. Okay, not even signs of habitation or farming or agriculture or occupation or anything. So, and again, a lot of people don't realize that a lot of South Africa is actually arid. It's actually very dry, just barren land. So, when you understand these facts, you understand that land redistribution becomes an anti-meritocratic system which depends on a victim class. Okay. Now, affirmation is well, in my mind, a very lazy medical understanding. Is it even a medical understanding? It's an ideological understanding. The idea that you treat people with affirmation comes from a political ideology. It does not come from a medical understanding of what's going on with gender dysphoria. Because with everything else, if you say you have dysphoria about anything else, we go into deep analysis and we spend weeks studying your behavior and unpacking your anxiety and everything. But if you say you have gender dysphoria, and some people might know already that gender itself is a bit of a made-up term anyway, all of a sudden it has magical powers, and suddenly the therapist and the endocrinologist and the psychiatrist and everybody must work as a team to sex change this person. Suddenly it actually becomes, it morphs into something else. The point being, though, the ultimate outcome is, though, that you create a new class, you create a victim class. People have really no idea that gender ideology is associated with radical Marxism, ultimately. Even some of the proponents of gender ideology, of affirmation, might not even realize that themselves. But when you study it properly and you go back to its origins, by the way, when you go right back to its origins, the people that were advocating for sex changes and broadly speaking, a victim class, the labeling of behavior, the over pathologization of human behavior, basically. Okay, so now every little nuance of human behavior can be labeled with some kind of disorder in the DSM-5. What they successfully did was, first of all, they create a marketing category. Okay, they create an entire market for themselves, which of course they've already got the product to sell you. Okay. By the way, Matt, something maybe everyone should know. I began my life working in advertising. When I was 19, I got a job in advertising, a designer, and I worked there until I was 23. And I left because I could see, even in those days, I could see that we were using sophisticated psychology to manipulate people into buying stuff that they don't need, you see. So now you've got two different powers that have come into play here. You've got a postmodernist ideology, often advanced by radical Marxists, self-declared Marxists. Okay, and then on the other hand, you've got a profit-seeking, yes, capitalist system. Not that I have a problem with capitalism in general, which is the pharmaceutical industry, which will take any opportunity. Guys, they've been selling junk breakfast cereals to your children for the last 40 years, 50, 60 years in America. It shouldn't be surprising that an entire industry will be born by profit-seeking, I mean, I don't want to call them sociopaths individually, but certainly the system is sociopathic, that will feed any dysphoria. We could have called it some other dysphoria and they would have fed that anyway. So the fact that there are products lying in wait, lying to be distributed, no one's actually monitoring. If you had a sudden growth in estrogen sales, that shouldn't be alarming. But the extent of the multi-billion dollar growth in the last, I think it's 7, 8 years, and in hormone therapy, indicates a massive problem. It indicates a profit incentive. All right. So ironically, you've got capitalists that are actually feeding this new victim class. But Matt, I don't know if I've made that clear. The two are both very much driven by an anti-meritocratic belief system, an ideology ultimately that seeks to create a victim class and take the levers of power, the levers of production, as Marx would have said, from those who have to give it to those who do not have. And it leverages democracy at the end of the day.
This speaks exactly to why I increasingly refer to it outright as gender communism.
Yeah.
So what I hear from your description of South Africa and the land problem and the one-party rule is that this sort of totalitarian ideology takes over in both cases, right? It's this idea that the state is going to provide the production. And in this case, of course, we're talking about the gender production. So, in fact, South Africa has seen a surprising, to me anyway, I was surprised to find out that there has been a setting in of transgenderism. It's state policy, it's subsidized. How on earth did Africans, by which I mean, we think of Africa, we think here in the West of traditional societies, right? We think of it being sort of an island of traditionalism, I guess. So how did Africans end up adopting European middle class ideas like Marxism? American elitist preoccupations like gender? Is the Tides Foundation, USAID money just that good? I know that the HIV AIDS, charity, and governance sector, for example, played a big
mm,
role in popularizing or in mainstreaming gender woo in South Africa. So, what exactly was decisive in that takeover, if you know?
mm, mm. I have an idea. If you go back for the last 50, 60 years, uh, African, and by African, I mean Black African intellectuals have been asking the West to desist from colonialism, essentially, completely. All right. They've been asking the West to let them either sink or thrive on their own. All right. Why have they been saying that? They've been saying that because, and if anyone doubts me, you should get the book by Dambisa Moyo. It's called Dead Aid. She explains this really well. And she's a Black African who I think she lives in America now, but she's half South African, half Kenyan, I think. And she explains this really well. The origins of tyranny and failed governments in South Africa, in Africa, in Southern Africa. A lot of people have theorized, well, people that have studied it. I mean, I'm talking about economists and legal experts or government policy experts that have studied it. They often come to the conclusion that it's actually money that comes from the West that corrupts the system. All right. So in other words, it creates a reward and incentive structure within the system to always be on your knees, basically. All right. So we are surprised when certain countries are constantly on their knees, but we reward them for being on their knees. All right. Now, that's a very simple way of putting it. It's obviously a bit more complicated than that. But what they've discovered repeatedly with governments that were maybe ousted if there was a coup or something, they find that those governments were playing up the Western powers, playing up the UN, these aid organizations, USAID's definitely one of them, but also the banking and loan system, okay, the World Bank and other banks that would then give them money to build a bridge or build a road or whatever. And sometimes the bridge or road would never even happen at all, okay? So they found a very clever way to use the masses, say whatever they need to hear, all right? Use the masses to get elected. Once elected, and of course, that's fairly easy. All you've got to do is complain about how unfair society is and how they need to rebuild the country. They get elected. Once they've got elected, they sing the same song to Western powers. The Western powers fall for it all over again for the umpteenth time in some cases, because there's a so-called new government when you actually find that a lot of the people are the same old people after all. But they sort of reinvent themselves. They get all the money donated all over again. A lot of it gets squandered. A lot of it gets blown by, I mean, I've actually been to some of these places in Africa where there's actual suburbs created just for the United Nations, for example, in Nairobi, okay? They get to drive around in massive SUVs and live these relatively lavish lifestyles while they're supposedly doing aid work in Africa, when in actual fact, the conditions for a lot of Africans haven't really changed in the last 30, 40 years. All right. Yes, they've changed in the sense that we have the internet. Okay. That's created a deceptive sense of change. But in reality, the material conditions, they're opportunities. So there are opportunities for growth, there are opportunities for independence and success. I'm talking about individuals now. Haven't really changed a hell of a lot. If you took out the internet, remember the internet is a global phenomenon. So the machine that comes to work where Africans are the necessary victims of essentially what we could call a drama triangle between the savior. There has to be a persecutor. Who's the persecutor? Well, it's poverty. It's past colonialism, oppression at some point, and the victim gets created. But the savior is waiting actually to save somebody, to save anybody, and that's these very liberal governments that come in. They need to be seen to be doing something. In the West, I'm talking about. So, in other words, what I'm saying is, if this sounds a bit confusing, if you simplify it to a drama triangle, okay, you've got savior, persecutor, and victim. All right. Africa has been stuck in the victim corner for decades now. Now, look, you can go back to developmental issues that we had that were initiated really by colonialism, all right, oppression, stripping of resources, all that other stuff. But we're now in 2025, and we know that at least $1 trillion has been pumped into Africa through aid. Okay, you can look that up if you want, with very little indication of success. When you consider that countries like Russia and China have invested as well, all right. So some of the ports built in Africa have been built actually by China, all right. So when you look at the way the whole thing is structured, it requires a victim class. So there's a reward and incentive system built into it.
We need to touch on one example that's in your online writing. It's called bilharzia. What a terrifying parasite. You say it stunts development in children. You specifically key on that. My apologies to the listening audience for this question, but could you explain that statement a little bit? Because it sounds like puberty blockers, and you say the government doesn't seem to care about it. Are you making that comparison?
Look, I didn't make it directly myself, but I see what you're doing there, and I kind of agree. You know, that you've picked up on the phenomenon of for the South African government, and this isn't just my opinion, by the way. This is a lot of critics of the South African government would say the same thing. The South African government has conveniently, so see if this sounds familiar, conveniently stood by, despite all the evidence of the contrary, conveniently stood by and allowed a victim class, which is genuine. These are genuine victims, okay, to develop and to I don't know if thrive is the right word, to grow, okay. The victim class being, in the one case, South African government ignores diseases. Preventable diseases is a massive problem in Africa in general, but in South Africa, it's getting worse and worse. I don't know how much detail I need to give you here, but let's just say I know a lot about the disease load in South Africa because of some connections that I have, and it's getting worse. All right, it's a decaying situation as we speak, even. On top of that, you've got the HIV, the denial of that HIV caused AIDS by the Mbeki administration. We need to go back 2 decades now. That's anyway, it's a couple of decades. I think it was 2000 and around 2004, I think. Anyway, whenever it was, there was a period that the ANC government in South Africa denied that ARVs could at least what's the word, arrest the development of HIV. Okay, this went on for a couple of years, and in that period, they estimate that around 3.6 million HIV/AIDS orphans were created because so many people died and they left their children behind. All right, 3.6 million, Matt, in one period. So in other words, fast forward 20 years, you've got a spiraling crime rate. And we know that people between the ages of 16 and 28 are the ones that usually commit crime. But we know that 20 years earlier, there was AIDS denial in South Africa, where all these people lost their parents. They lost their family structure. They lost providers, and they were put into, in some cases, very, very bad environments, often being cared for by like grandmothers or uncles or something like that, but they were often abused. And by the way, this isn't just my little theory. The International Labour Organization, which is a massive international organization, has studied this over the years, and they did an amazing report about it, where a lot of these kids ended up essentially as slaves. Okay, so modern day slavery, one of the known categories in modern day slavery are the AIDS orphans from Thabo Mbeki's era. Okay, I've written about this stuff before, but it's sort of hidden in my bio, you know. So you need to understand that there's 20 years later, we've got adults that suffered this massive trauma, you know, when they were children. A lot of them didn't survive, but many of them were put into. When I say slavery, what I mean, by the way, is when you've got 9 different children being looked after by one grandmother, the hierarchy kicks in. All right, the child that has no parents will be the one that's forced to go and fetch water from the river. All right, now that child, which by the way is very common. I mean, maybe people listening don't understand that a child going to fetch water in Africa is a very common thing. All right, when that child goes there, often he finds dirty water and they end up drinking that water and they get this bilharzia parasite. All right, it's in some areas it's very common. It is quite easy to treat, but of course the government doesn't provide the information or the resources. That's just one parasite that I'm talking about. There's diseases, there's other viral diseases, there's other parasites, and there's other conditions that lead to stunted development. Even as we speak, in one district, there's I can't remember the name of it now, but there's the bloating of the stomach that happens from malnutrition. That is a known problem in the one region in South Africa as we speak. This is in the modern day South Africa. You've got some areas that have 78% unemployment in certain areas. In general, I think the last figure they gave, national unemployment was 44%, but that's probably a charitable figure. So Matt, you've got really quite dystopian conditions, you know. So yes, I would say that when you compare the policy of massive organizations like the APA and in the American Psychology Association in America and other organizations around the Western world, where they seem determined to create victims. They are knowingly, despite available evidence and better alternatives. That's the part that's really sick. Despite better alternatives, they would rather create iatrogenic harm, victims of unintended consequence of medical treatment. All right, that's iatrogenic harm. Sometimes surgical. I mean, thousands of cases now, thousands and thousands of cases where these people are dependent on the state. So now how convenient to create, which is exactly what they're doing in South Africa. You're creating an entire subculture of victimology or of dependence that require the state to provide grants or pensions or disability, as you would call it in America, because they literally survive on that. All right. Now, once you're in, and this is the other studies that you'd have to go, you'd have to connect these other studies that they do, where they connect, once someone is in that deprived and disabled category, the victim class, it's very difficult to climb out of it. All right. And then they'll go around talking about how they're going to implement new policies to try and lift these people out of poverty. But of course, a lot of that doesn't work because it's still anchored in the same mentality. It's very, it's glossed over, because that's the same thing they do in South Africa. They'll announce that they're opening a new medical facility when people just down the road are still dying of bilharzia, of this parasite that you talked about.
You read Steven Pinker's book. I have it on the shelf. I've not read it yet. It's been sitting a while in my anti-library. That's the word for the books that you intend to read someday when you get around to it. I keep meaning to get around to it. I'm taking it on a plane trip this week to actually try and read it. What was it about the blank slate that made you decide to become a therapist? And what does that concept of the blank slate have to do with South Africa?
Yeah, well, excellent book, first of all. I think Steven Pinker lately has been a little bit too vocal about Trump. He seems to have become a little bit obsessed with that. But all along, he's been very rational about the postmodernist threat. Okay, I think he's been writing about that probably longer than most people, because I think it goes back 30 years with him. like many other people. I mean, Camille Paglia as well. She wrote about the threat of postmodernism 30 years ago already. Um, so the Blank Slate book talks about the idea from behaviorism in psychology, where um, uh, Skinner and people like him, the behaviorists of that era, the 1960s, where they would talk about, for example, give me a child and I'll create something special for you. Um, this of course we now know is ridiculous. Okay, there's genetics, there's environment, there's personality traits, there's all these complicated things, and it's almost impossible to predict how any individual is going to turn out in even in dystopian conditions. Okay, by the way, I'm evidence of that because I grew up very poor. It might surprise some people um, that white people can grow up very poor in South Africa. We grew up very, very poor. We had to hunt pigeons at one stage just to have dinner. I was taken away from my mother when I was 9, um, and I was left to fend for myself when I was 15. So at various different points in my life, I could have ended up, dead or in jail, basically. And I managed to uh, grow and learn, and I ended up with my own business by the time I was 30. And I ended up with a psychology degree by the time I was 50. So that's the reason why we're talking today. So the Blank Slate would say that you can pick any child and turn them into a genius. Now that idea, behaviorism in general, is sort of hijacked, I would say, by the postmodernists who say it's in the reach of humanity to create utopia. All right, but that's a nice idea, but to actually implement it, you would have to believe in the blank slate. You would have to ignore all the other things that influence our behavior, and you would have to have the idea that you can manufacture. This is the socially constructed society, socially constructed language. You can switch genders if you just switch pronouns. That comes from the same place. The blank slate is talking about that children are born blank and we can program them to be whatever we want as long as we program them correctly. All right. So this is why the what's the word, the retaliation that's happening recently, that a lot of radicals on the left are saying, is that you have people on the right are in a cult. They're accusing the people on the right of being in a cult. Okay. So behind that idea is that you have been, if you were conservative, you've been programmed the wrong way. All right. So it's got nothing. So it's easy to vilify you because you've just been programmed the wrong way. So they can dehumanize you that way. You see, if you accept, look, think about it. If you have to accept that, well, look, first of all, my genes are this, my genetics are this and this and this, my personality traits, which are very strongly innate, are XYZ. My lived experiences are XYZ. My circumstances, resources, influences, traumas, all these things. I mean, no one has figured out exactly how all these things will impact us. All we do is we try and manage them as and when they happen. But to create a utopian society, you'd have to believe that you can reprogram people. So you have to believe in the blank slate, ultimately. You see, so the utopia idea drives the dehumanization of anyone that thinks traditionally or conservatively, because it's embedded in the idea that you were programmed wrong. So you're just a mistake, basically. When you're forced to accept that there's all these other factors going on, it actually forces you to be genuinely accepting and compassionate.
Yes, it certainly does. One of the things that I have found in my reading on modern political religions is, in fact, that they all do this. They make this, I'm going to use a word here, this Gnostic splitting of the world into good and evil, and everyone is either good or evil, right? So, for example, just recently, Tara Dublin, who is a progressive personality, this is someone who had a blow up with me on Twitter last week.
Wow.
And here's the thing. She and I had been following each other for a decade. And a decade ago, I warned her about a con artist named Jason Wade Taylor, who lives in Texas. The man was not really that political, not really that politically aware, not really that ideologically attuned, but he knew how to mimic the progressive orthodoxy to just basically win her
Mm,
over.
mm,
And she did not listen to me. And she got burned by the experience. And she came back around and she apologized to me and unblocked me. And we were
mm,
friends for a decade until this moment when she's defending Leah Thomas, another con artist. So we've come back around again. And the reason why she's doing this is because she's splitting the world into good and evil in her mind. Leah Thomas has become the victim class. So I have to defend him. It's like this
mm,
split of the world into good and evil that makes people behave in strange new ways. And it is something that Robert J. Lifton identified in, for example, the communist re education camps as well as Auschwitz. Okay, so
mm,
it's this common thing in the sort
mm.
of brainwashing, reprogramming, dehumanizing systems of totalitarianism.
Yeah.
So let me affirm that observation. You write that adolescents are struggling with materialism in the West. I saw recently that the median American teenager expects to get a job as an influencer and make as much money as Mr. Beast. That's the life plan now. Narcissism is rewarded in this social media culture.
Mm,
And you say that adulthood requires a transition, to borrow a word, from the self-centered, knuckle-headed teenager to a managed narcissism, right? We have to learn to manage our
mm,
narcissism.
mm,
I don't know if you've noticed, but the character arcs that the creators of our big budget movies assign to their female leads now is the girl boss.
mhm,
She doesn't have to get awesome. She doesn't have to become awesome. She is born awesome and everyone around her just needs to recognize how awesome she is and then the story's
mm,
over.
mm,
The popular culture got feminized and it got this girl boss, this anti-meritocratic female figure.
mm,
And audiences, as a result, have just about abandoned the movie theaters because it turns out that women who were supposed to be the audience that would justify this, they were going to come fill the theaters. And it turned out that women actually like seeing manly men on the screen. Who
mhm,
knew? And of course, men were turned off. So there's no audience. The blank
mm,
slate is a view from nowhere, and nobody wants it. And so this has become a genuine capitalist crisis for Disney, Paramount, the Marvel and Lucasfilm franchises.
mm,
And I noticed that you used the hero's journey, classic Joseph Campbell stuff in your counseling. And you have like Top Gun Maverick has shown Hollywood that audiences respond to the hero's journey. So we're seeing
mm,
all that sludge that took years to go through the production line is coming out now, and creatives are struggling to create the new Tom Cruise, manly man movie.
mm.
Do you think that culture is ready for a reaction to the built-in narcissism and materialism of social media, with phone-free schools happening and so on? Can the hero's journey make a comeback and maybe save us all?
Yes, I love this question. The hero's journey is not just some abstract thing that sounds cool and has made for interesting movies. Guys, going back, what, 3,000 years? Okay, go back to the Greek myths, the legends, the tragedies of Greek mythology. The hero's journey is a recurring theme, all right? Well, because the hero's journey is a story of the human DNA, actually, all right? If you understand evolutionary psychology properly in its application, you understand that we are driven from a cellular level. We are driven to procreate. Whether you procreate or not, it's not so much the point, but the fact that you have this innate drive. Okay, um, so with all the stories, whether they're from the east, the west, the south, the north, of the planet, you have a recognizable human behavior. All right, that's a theme running across cultures that never crossed each other. They never met. All right. The theme is overcoming adversity, surviving, and experiencing some kind of transcendence. All right, that's embedded in all religions, most religions. I would say the successful religions, if there's such a thing. It's the other way around, and this is how you need to interpret even yourself accurately, correctly, is that in the hero's journey and in mythology and the tragedies, the movies that we watch, the books that we read, it's because it's familiar. It's a familiar journey. That's, some people theorize this is like a species-wide subconscious memory, all right, that we have of surviving and overcoming adversity. The fact is, the human species has survived unimaginable horrors and still persists and still grows and still thrives. Well, I mean, I know not all of us are thriving, but I'm talking about as a species, we're clearly this extremely successful species. So when you understand it properly, you actually understand that it's the other way around. The reason we create the stories is because they mimic real life. They mimic our actual journey, which I would argue begins from the minute you're born. All right. I heard someone say the other day, I don't know who it was, but someone said, life begins when you realize that you needed everything you need to be happy you received when you were born, the day you were born. You don't actually need anything else. And I really like that understanding because it sets up the noble goal, I would call it. Okay, so I like the word noble. I try and avoid some of these other terms that are floating around at the moment. Of the human spirit, which is to survive, first and foremost. You survive childhood. You think about that. You survive bumbling around, crawling around on the floor, eating cat poo and swallowing rocks, and God knows what else we all did. All of us did as toddlers. Then you survive being an adolescent, which we all know was traumatic at best. And then you finally get to adulthood where you have some kind of responsibility. And most of us mess that up for about 10 years. And only around 35 do you reach some kind of, responsible autonomy where you actually have some impact and some say in how you feel every day in what you're doing. So what I would say is the recognizable human journey is something that we create stories about. It's not that we create stories and then we get some sort of satisfaction out of it. We are creating the stories to mimic what we all live and experience in varying degrees anyway. All right. Then there's another aspect, which maybe I should just mention quickly, is the reason we go watch these stories is because we want to be inspired, not indulged. There's a big difference. Okay. If you think about it, if I just indulge you all day long, you're going to get really bored. But if I inspire you, I'm actually invigorating you. Now, that's a different thing. You might be exhausted if I spend an entire day invigorating you, inspiring you and invigorating you. Okay. But you would take that any day over a day of indulgence where you're bored and lethargic by the end of the day. So we despite ourselves, we go and we watch horror movies, we go and we watch action movies, we go and we watch dramas. A lot of that is hinges on being inspired and being invigorated and in fact being challenged. All right. Some movies are intellectually challenging. So actually what we want is we want more of that in our lives. All right. But yes, of course, we need more of that in our lives in a controlled manner, which is why it's nice to go and watch something that lasts 2 hours and then we can get up and walk out the theater and go back to our regular lives. So I just wanted to give that background of the hero's journey. I mean, for people that don't know, the hero's journey was kind of conceptualized by ancient storytellers, but then formalized, I would say, by people like Jung, maybe Freud and Jung, we could say, but it's become a crucial part of psychology for many of us, not for everybody, but for many of us, in understanding that we have this process of setting off on a journey and transcending into what we call the special world, where in the special world we are confronted with the shadow self, the version of ourselves that that we didn't know. We sort of go and find ourselves in the abyss. The language is very dramatic, deliberately, you know. All stories follow this theme, all right? Because there's a transcendence when you come back to the ordinary world, let's say, and that's the sort of spiral that the hero's journey usually uses, where you come away from understanding the shadow self. You've confronted the shadow self. You've integrated the self, the shadow, and you've learned how to live in two worlds. All right. So does this sound familiar? Detransitioners. All right. This is very much. I can tell you that a lot of detransitioners I met are suddenly very wise. Not. I want to be clear here. That doesn't mean they're happy, and that doesn't mean they're suddenly able to advise everyone else, as you said earlier, on how they should live their lives. But certainly by their own measure, by their own judgment, they are far wiser when they've detransitioned, because there's a sort of a return to normality, but with the knowledge of having lived in the two separate worlds, these two different worlds of meeting the shadow self, confronting the shadow self, surviving that whole ordeal, coming back from the abyss, to use the language from the hero's journey. So look, we all do this in different degrees. In fact, you need to understand, you need to conceptualize it properly, that we all need this. It's not something that I think a lot of people do try and avoid it, the deflect, deny, and delay. This is very common. I mean, look at puberty blockers are designed to delay maturity, delay adulthood. Deny, I don't want to be that sex. I don't want to be the role that was carved out for me by my ancestors, and deflect it, and deflecting the responsibilities, the roles, the division of labor, whatever you want to call it, only to find that you've deflected yourself into a different set of roles and behavior. So there's no escaping the hero's journey. It's a process that you must follow. There's another theory which I'm just going to throw in here for the real nerds, is Dabrowski's theory of positive disintegration, which if you apply that as well, then you understand that initially it will look and feel like a disintegration, but properly understood, you recognize that you're just in the abyss and you're confronting the shadow, and this is a necessary part of transcendence. And when you see the bigger picture, you don't have all the associated nihilism and anxiety that comes with finding yourself suddenly in this very dark space, confronting the shadow self, which can sound like a horror movie, so to speak, But when you see the bigger picture, when you understand the journey, the path of the journey, then you realize it's a positive disintegration, that reintegration is in fact inevitable. It's just a matter of when.
Actually, what you said about indulging versus inspiring bears on that question, because one of the things that we see in these terrible movies that comes out is a whole lot of fan service. That's what it's called. Member berries also. These sort of things that are supposed to be, red meat for the lover of the franchise. See, we did that thing. We used that phrase, right? That you remember from that other movie. And it doesn't work. It doesn't make the fans happy because there's nothing inspirational about The Acolyte, for example. There's nothing inspirational about Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. These are terrible films. So no matter how much they indulge the audience, they don't inspire and they don't do well. So that is an interesting point. Existentialism is a term that you use for the fears and anxieties that drive transition and detransition. You are into existential psychology. That's not literary existentialism. We're not getting sidetracked into Sisyphus and Camus. We won't do that to the audience. What I want to know is whether you agree, this word, existentialism. Am I understanding it correctly that it refers metaphorically to a spiritual crisis of epistemic meaning in the modern world? And what does that have to do with this shadow self?
If we say on the one hand, we have this sort of undiscovered part of ourselves that lies dormant, all right, that represents, we could say, abilities, capacities, insights, even personas, okay, that we could develop if and when and how needed. All right. Whether we should or shouldn't is the question. That is the question we really wake up with every day. All right. And now we start touching on exist. Like, what is your existence about? Existentialism. Okay. First, you must confront the fact that you exist. Okay. Then you must decide, what am I going to do with this existence? And the modern, your first question on this segment was, is this generation, captured by consumerism? And that's why I say, yes, they are. All right. They are, well, not just this generation, I would say this era. And it, by the way, it's a Western problem, because a lot of other communities around the world don't really have this problem. All right. I think consumption is a problem generally around the world, but whether or not it dominates is a different story. All right. I would say, and maybe I'm a little bit biased, but I would say that across most of Africa, people are very consumed with their responsibility. I'm talking about individuals, like the regular person is consumed with their responsibilities to their family, to their children, or maybe their brothers and sisters, and their role in society rather than their gender. Okay. I kind of didn't answer you earlier on this particular point. I should make it clear that gender ideology is very much seen as, I would call it a pathogen, all right, but it's treated like a pathogen in Africa. They know it's not an endemic problem, all right. Gender ideology is something that's been imported, it's been imposed, it's been manufactured, and it is creating a class differential within Africa. But most people in Africa, I would bet, and I do know obviously a lot of people in Africa, across Africa. I've been to Kenya and Botswana and Mozambique and all over Southern Africa. So I would say most of them are really not concerned with gender ideology at all, remotely. It's probably highly offensive to them because, as I say, they've got real world problems to deal with. They've got roles and responsibilities that are existential. Okay, so if we say existential crisis, yes, your mental health can be an existential crisis, but when you reconceptualize it and you realize in the West, for example, when you realize that you have ideas of existential anxiety that are rooted in whether or not you're consuming. So the value system that has been created, manufactured, I would say, in the West has been, you are valued by how much you consume. All right. Do you have a mortgage? Do you have a car you're paying off? How many clothes do you buy every month? How fancy is your cell phone? That is a value-based value system that's based on consumption. Okay, on ongoing, continuous consumption. Whereas in a lot of the world, that's just not a thing. It's just, you're valued for many, many other things in other parts of the world. And people from other parts of the world could speak to themselves. But as I say, I've seen this. And at the moment, by the way, I live in Sweden, where there's also this culture in Scandinavian countries of lagom, which is kind of summarized, I would say, as moderation. Not to say that they are not wealthy and they don't consume, but there is a kind of taboo to excessive, unnecessary consumption, and certainly bragging is not really appreciated amongst most people, at least in the part of Sweden I live in, which is more in the north. So to bring it back to, yes, they are very much dominated by the value system that they found when they were born. They get born into this world where consumption is how you are valued. So we are shocked that people have found ways by using cell phones and the internet and cameras to turn themselves into products. Because after all, what is a transitioned person? A transitioned person is a product of a modern technological advancement in medical science. All right. So based on consumption, they have produced themselves as an identity to be consumed by other people. You see, so it's a consumption-based value system. If you remove that, if you remove the consumption, there is no system. There is no value in that. And I would say that that's what a lot of people, unfortunately, have got horribly wrong, and they still don't quite see that they're doing it. In the fact that they're creating this value system that is anchored by consumption. So if you understand that the shadow represents the sort of dormant part of us, the hidden part, existentialists believe that you can be generating anxiety. So this will sound, I need to break this down carefully because this sounds very counterintuitive to most people's understanding of what anxiety is. Imagine a scenario where you can have anxiety for doing nothing. All right. So first of all, that's already, people don't understand that. People think they get anxiety from doing stuff, from doing too much. Okay. I think it gets sort of mixed in with burnout very often. But in actual fact, understood properly, when you apply evolutionary psychology, when you are not growing as a person, you're not advancing your your mating status, your social status. I'm not talking about financial status here, okay? Because you might not be rich, but you might still be a viable mate, all right? For procreation, I'm talking about. All of these things involve exploring the shadow and taking from that space within us a self that is meaningful and productive in the world that we find ourselves in, whichever that may be, all right? So existentialism acknowledges that in actual fact, when you're living someone else's life, which you would be doing if you were living a consumption-based value paradigm, right? When you live someone else's life and someone else's values that have been manufactured on your behalf, you are actually generating anxiety within. So you've actually created the little engine that's creating all your anxiety. All right. So they wake up in the morning and they go, oh my God, I'm so anxious. I must consume more is the solution. Okay. Why? Because the TV told you the night before that that's what you must do. All right. So you go off and you consume more. And of course, you have more anxiety. Why? Because you are suppressing the shadow, generally speaking. You're suppressing the untapped part of you. You don't know yourself fully. All right. So we talk about in psychology, this is Jungian psychology mostly, but Freud also spoke about this, about integrating the shadow. That means you must go through yourself. You must learn yourself. You must apply the aspects of yourself that are meaningful to your society, and you must apply them properly. Otherwise, you will definitely generate anxiety. So this type of anxiety is the kind of anxiety that you can create from doing nothing. All right. Or from living someone else's life. And if you're living a completely novel and manufactured set of values, in other words, consumption-based society that the West is at the moment, you are by definition living someone else's values. So you are creating existential anxiety. Now, if you imagine a jar, Matt, 3/4 of the jar is made up of existential anxiety. All right. That's kind of the human condition. You have an underlying anxiety, which is waking you up every day and saying, what are you going to do with your life today? What are you going to do with your life today? What are you going to, and I mean, other questions as well. Are you going to survive? Do you have relatives? Do you have relations with other people? Do you have competency? Do you have autonomy? Okay. And this touches on self-determination theory, which I won't get into too much now. But all of these things activate when you understand existentialism correctly, that it is in fact by going into the self, understanding the self, developing personas that are relevant to the world that you live in, that are productive, that are creative. All right. When I say creative, I don't mean that you're an artist. I mean that you are productive. So you create something. All right. When you understand that relationship, you're engaging the shadow correctly. All right. Because it's a constant inquiry into the self. What can I do? What can I do? What can I do better? But it's relative to the purpose and meaning of its utility to other people. Okay. So I'm not saying, I don't want everyone to think that I'm some kind of creative elitist, because I mean, I happen to be an artist as well, but these are principles that are rooted in psychology and philosophy, and I would argue in the ancient myths as well. What is the purpose of your existence? What is the goal of your life? And again, I'm going to use that term noble. Were they noble? When you're dying, people want to know what you did with your life. They don't want to know how many packets of chips you consumed in your life, or how many cars you owned, or how many cell phones you owned. They want to know what you did with your life. So sometimes this is a technique we use in therapy, is we ask people to say, what would you like to be on the front of your book, the autobiography about your life? What would you like the byline to be? What would you like the epitaph on your funeral, on your gravestone to be? And it really catches people, makes them think deeply. You know how often people I get that can't even answer that question. They really go blank, which I think is revealing, you know. So, so existentialism, in psychology at least, existential psychology understands, for me, understands anxiety correctly. It understands the majority of your anxiety correctly. It conceptualizes it correctly and understands that you could be creating anxiety by either doing nothing or by doing all the wrong things. And when you include unnecessary consumption, that's almost definitive that you are not aligned with your purpose and your meaning, because you've already stopped contributing to the world. You're now taking more than you contribute. All right. That is an existential crisis.
It's so interesting. You work with detransitioners worldwide. You have a South African perspective, but you live in Sweden. So you understand the intersection of so many different themes in this complex story of woke and gender. You have a trip to Berlin coming up. What's that all about?
Yeah, that's the SEGM and Therapy First conference in Berlin in September. I can't remember the dates exactly now. But that's going to be super interesting because some of my colleagues, I would say, from working with this population are going to be there. I think there's going to be some research presented. SEGM, of course, creates some of their own research. They host some of the papers and studies that have been done that are critical of gender ideology. And I think what's going to be good about it, it's going to be very focused, as far as I can tell, it's going to be very focused on, how do we treat these people? So what I like about that is we're acknowledging that these people are the unwitting recipients of a maladaptive medical and psychological system that's gone completely off the rails. Versus maybe just talking about it, so like I find a lot of people are just finding new ways to describe the problem, and not many people are. Well, I suppose not many people have the skills or the power to do something about it. But there's a lot of talk happens, Matt. I don't know if you follow what I'm saying here, because I think some people have discovered this problem quite late, and you'll hear the same questions being asked over and over. On Twitter, for example, I often get asked the same questions that have been answered repeatedly over and over again. So what I'm interested in now is connecting with my peers who are working with these people, or who, obviously some of them were working with this population long before I came along, and I'm interested in learning from them and sharing my experiences with the current cohort that we have. Specifically, Matt, if I can just plug one little beef that I have with the whole narrative at the moment, the discourse at the moment. There's a sort of vilification that happens of the males. Okay, I think a lot of people mix up the younger males who have been victims of the war against masculinity, which goes back already 40 years. We already had incels 20 years ago, people that have chosen to, the involuntary celibates, people have chosen to opt out of the gender roles that they were assigned at birth, right? Which of course is ridiculous. There's no opting out. This is the heart of existentialism, is understanding that there's no opting out. There is no opting out. If you opt out, you will suffer. You suffer and you suffer and you suffer until you find a way. This is where the hero's journey comes in. You have to go deep. You do have to go deep and find a way to contribute to your environment, to your society. You have to. There is no alternative. Now, how you do that and exactly what you do is open to you. It's open to interpretation. It's open to your resources and your skills and all these other things. And that's a lot of the work that I do, is I just help people reboot that journey. So for me, it's not, if I can just be clear about something, it's not about making them so-called detransition. And I've noticed some of the detransitioners have also said they don't like to be called detransitioners, because they're also starting to understand it. And I must thank my group for pointing this out, that, detransition implies that transition was a state, was like an actual state that you could achieve. They don't actually believe that. They don't believe that it's even possible. There was, I think it's better to conceptualize it as a journey to the self, enabled and misguided and misdirected by professionals in most cases, to become a medical procedure, a medical process. So that exacerbates it and complicates it, of course, by orders of magnitude. But in principle, it's a journey to the self, into the abyss, into understanding what is my worth, what is my value, into trying to find an alternate persona to exist in the world that is not vulnerable to being bullied, that is not vulnerable to maybe sexism or worse, assault in some cases. But then with the males, they suffer this other thing, which, as I've spoken about before, is the bias against males in general, that really some people believe that men are just violent aggressors, perpetrators waiting to happen. There's this radical position. Of course, I know it's not most people, but it does fuel a lot of the research. It certainly is part of postmodernism. Masculinity is perceived as a threat, because masculinity is very much a meritocracy. Amongst men, we compete with each other. That's a meritocratic system. So if they can devalue and emasculate men, they can also impact the meritocracy, which I must say we've seen around the Western world. We've seen the results of that. Okay. And by the way, guys, this is nothing new that I'm saying. People have been talking about this for 40 years already. People far braver and wiser than me. People like Warren Farrell. If you don't know who he is, you can look him up. He wrote the book, The Boy Crisis. The guy that wrote that book, Iron John. I know there's lots of literature out there that speaks to this kind of thing, and men have certainly responded and reacted by, I think, trying to revive noble ideals, noble goals. But doing that in a constantly hostile world is very difficult. So to get to my point, in the trans crisis, let's call it, there's a sub-crisis, which is the fact that young men who actually just don't want to be perceived as men, okay, they inevitably then are automatically perceived as women. So the irony of their dilemma is that they have such a strong need to conform that they pursue the transitioning. I've had, just this last few weeks, I've had 2 different male transitioners tell me that they didn't want breasts from taking spironolactone and estrogen. Okay, they actually didn't want breasts. I mean, this is contrary to some of the discourse that we hear from people that are critical of trans women. Okay, and I'm using inverted commas here, because what we see in public and on social media is the sociopaths and psychopaths who conveniently are transitioning in their 40s and 50s. Okay, this is a very different group of men. I would say, I would guess that a lot of them have mental health issues anyway, but some of them are certainly sociopaths and psychopaths, in my opinion. The ones that, go and deliberately take pictures in females' bathrooms. These are the types that have come because the grass is the greenest. All right. They found a way to access vulnerable spaces. They've taken that availability. All right. But it's this society that created the social permission for that to happen in the first place. So what we forgot when we created this new victim class was that it would draw predators. All right. So that's what those people are. They've been drawn to where the grass is greenest, as I say. But the other population, the younger males, are actually just unsure of how to be men in the world, because there's so much vilification, stigmatizing men's sexuality, men's behavior, men's aggression, that these very, I mean, look at the description we get of most of these people, male or female, often on the spectrum, which means what they usually mean is their social skills aren't great, often highly intelligent, and often very sensitive and creative. All right, that's the most common description we get. Certainly of the boys, the younger males that I'm getting, that's a very, very common description, probably of every single one of them. So what we've got is we've got a type of male that has come into the world with, I think IQ has a lot to do with it as well. They've got high IQ. It's mixed in with a lot of creativity. There's something called eductive thinking, which I don't have really have time to get into now, but people can look it up. This is about fluid intelligence, basically. All right. So fluid intelligence is a little bit more creative. It requires more information, and the world just isn't really equipped to deal with these new types that we're finding in this generation, Gen Z, I'm talking about. Okay. So unfortunately, I've described two different populations. Okay. We've got an older population that is made up of either men with mental health, genuine mental health issues, or mixed in with a lot of sociopaths and psychopaths and narcissists, inevitably, because that would be mixed in there, who are taking advantage. And yes, they have paraphilias. They are often antisocial personality types, and maybe deviants as well. But the younger males are being painted with the same brush. And what I see parents coming to me sometimes alarmed, like completely horrified that their son is presenting as trans. When in actual fact, what he's trying to say, but doesn't have the language or the emotional intelligence yet to do that, is he's trying to say, I'm terrified of becoming a man. And that's the element that I wish we could address more directly, is why are so many young men terrified to become men? Okay, why are so many young males? Because it's not just the young trans males, it's the whole incel population, which, by the way, is massive. People don't actually realize how massive that population is. So why are so many young men rejecting manhood? That's the real question we need to ask. And look, I must be honest, a lot of men need to ask themselves, they need to look in the mirror and they need to say, what have we shown this generation about manhood, about adulthood in general? I work with parents to help them correct that image as well, to help them project a more autonomous and liberated, I would say, adulthood, because it's deceptive. If you look at someone who's got a mortgage, 2 cars to pay off, and 3 kids to feed, they look like they have no autonomy, But in actual fact, adults have a lot of autonomy. We just don't exercise it very often. So we've also got to ask ourselves some difficult questions. But I wanted to just point that out, that why I attend these conferences often is to speak on behalf of these younger men who should not be vilified, but also at the same time to confront I would say, the social disease of excluding masculinity, excluding the input of men, but also at the same time acknowledging that men have also been maybe neglected in mental health. Well, not maybe, they have been neglected in mental health for the last 40 years, I would say. So we need to give them the resources so that they can rebuild that emotional intelligence that they themselves would want. And by the way, I'm talking about men of all ages. I'm talking 40, 50, 60. It's been lost somewhere along the line,
In the meantime, where can listeners find your work?
So I try to publish regularly with PsychReg. That's psych as in psychology, and then reg.org. I've got a couple of articles that are published on there. You can just look up my name, Angelo Vincent Deboni. That's my full name, by the way. The Vincent is my middle name. And then I've put a couple of articles. There's one coming out, I think, this week on PsychReg, and another one on the Center for Male Psychology UK as well. I've published a couple of times with them. I've got my own page. If you just go to my bio, if you just Google me, you'll find my own WordPress page that I sometimes put stuff on. There's 1 or 2 other interviews I've done there as well, going back 3 years or so. But mostly I'm pretty busy running groups, support groups, and meeting clients. I deal with other things as well, Matt. I do life coaching as well. I'll deal with basically anyone who's willing to address the existential component, because some people are actually not ready. It is a pretty deep dive that we need to do. But at the same time, how do you approach that initially is by just remotivating people. So I spend a lot of time in most of my sessions just remotivating people, helping them normalize their behavior. And then every now and then I will put stuff on Twitter that's a little bit more detailed. That's at Vincent Psych, SE.
Vincent Deboni, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you very much, Matt.
Thank you for listening to the full podcast. The Distance is an encampment for everyone made politically homeless by gender ideology. Visit our website at www.thedistancemag.com to support our work with a monthly or annual premium subscription.